this video, I'll be discussing the 4 benefits of building background knowledge. The first of which is that when you build background knowledge, you provide the vocabulary necessary for comprehension. What we know through research is that if as little as 5% of the words in a passage are unknown to the reader, comprehension can be negatively affected. Take this example. Say you're a basketball coach and you're relying on your scouts to go out and watch the games live and report back to you on which players should continue to recruit or offer a scholarship, or maybe just start watching some other players and let them go, whatever that may be. You're relying on your scouts. Say you're sitting in your office one day, you get a text message from the scout that says, "This player is the most maladroit sophomore I've ever seen." What if you don't know all the words in that text message? How are you as a coach and the final decision maker for what happens with your team going to know if you should continue to pursue and scout this student or this student athlete, or if you should offer him a scholarship, or if you should pull back the resources and start focusing on another athlete? If you don't know what this sentence means, and you don't know what decision to make, and you don't know how to comprehend the true meaning that the scout was trying to relay to you, most likely where you would get tripped up in this sentence is at the word maladroit. I don't know what that means. This kid could be incredible. I mean, there's an exclamation mark at the end of this sentence. Maybe this sophomore is an amazing player. But what if maladroit's a negative term? Well, this is a seasoned scout. Maybe this is one of the worst players he's ever seen. It is all hinged on my knowledge of this word. But if I already knew before that text message came through that the word maladroit means butterfingered or fumbling or just not very coordinated, if I knew that and I had that background knowledge, as soon as that text comes in, I read it and I think, wow, this kid, we better not pursue him. I respond saying, go ahead and lead the game, go on to the next athlete. And I can make that decision because I've comprehended what that scout was saying and the true meaning, and therefore I can move on with that information. When we build background for our students, we provide the vocabulary necessary for comprehension, and that's where you have to know your students. You have to know when you pre-read a passage. The worst thing that teachers could do, or one of the worst, is to assign text that they haven't read. That's never appropriate, because you need to know and you need to have a firm gauge on what that text says, what vocabulary is in that text, to know if your students are going to get tripped up. You know your students, and you know what's potentially going to give them problems. So you need to read that text, know what vocabulary could potentially trip them up and what could negatively affect comprehension, and then you are responsible for building that background for those students before that text ever hits their hands. The next benefit of building background is that when you build background, you bridge gaps intentionally left by the writer. Now, we know that when we read something or when we write something, we can't tell everything. And we know that as a reader that the writer couldn't tell us everything. There's not enough space, there's not enough time, and we don't want to read something like that. We certainly don't want to write something like that. We have to know or make some predictions about who our audience is and what they already know. That's like many times at the university level or even the high school curriculum, they'll say that one class has a prerequisite. And before you can even start this coursework, you better have taken another class, because we're going to start at a level assuming that you already have a knowledge base. And that's what writers do as well. So those writers have to intentionally leave gaps, assuming that their readers know what they're talking about. So take this sentence, for example. Martha felt honored that her son's friend wrote all over her wall the night before her birthday. If you don't have the background knowledge, you know what all of these words mean. So this isn't a case of the number one benefit of building background and a vocabulary problem. We know all of these words. But if we don't have the background knowledge to know that there's a gap here that the writer intentionally left, if we don't know what they're talking about, we might question the validity of this sentence. Why would a mother feel honored that her son's bratty friend came to her house and wrote graffiti or something all over her wall? Why would anybody feel honored, much less the night before her birthday? You would be very frustrated, most people would, because you're going to have to clean that up. But if in fact the writer knew the audience and knew that the audience would understand or have a working knowledge of what Facebook is, then he can say this sentence and then move on. Because we know what a wall is on Facebook. And in fact, if your son's friend took the time to wish you a happy birthday on your wall and write all over it the night before your birthday, maybe you would feel honored. You have that working knowledge of what Facebook is and what a Facebook wall is. You can read that and move right along. As an instructor, as a teacher, if you question the background knowledge of your students as a whole and wonder if for any reason they're not going to know the gaps or understand or fill those gaps that the writer intentionally leaves, it's your job to fill those gaps so everybody's on the same playing field, so when they read the text that you assign, they can comprehend at the level that you wish. This next one is interesting. The third benefit of building background is it clears space and working memory. Let's do a quick recap of the types of memory. We have long-term memory. So if I asked you, what day were you born? What's your name? These things that are always going to be ever present in your brain because you're just always going to remember them. That's long-term memory. If I asked you, what did you have for lunch yesterday? You're probably going to think back and tell me that's in your short-term memory. Working memory is what you're dealing with in your brain for enough time that you can produce what you need to produce or use it for the purposes you need to use it and then move on. So the best example I can give of this is, doesn't happen much anymore with smartphones and technology, but say 10 years ago, if you wanted to order a pizza, what you would do is you would walk to the yellow pages and you would look up your favorite pizza place. You would say the number to yourself, and then what would you do until you got to the phone? You would repeat that 10-digit number over and over and over in your head. Maybe just 7 digits, assuming you remember the area code, but you would repeat it in your head until you got to the phone. Then you would repeat it as you're dialing. You would place your pizza order. 30 minutes later, the pizza gets here. You're eating. You're having a great time. More people show up, and they say, hey, we need some more pizza. What was the number of the pizza place? And you have no clue. Because it wasn't relevant enough to move to the short-term memory or move to the long-term memory because you only needed it for working memory. You're holding it in your brain until you used it, then you're done with it. The third benefit of building background knowledge is that it can clear space in your working memory so you can work with more things or produce more of whatever it may be that you're working on. So, for example, take a look at this list. See how many you can come up with. My guess is not many. You're not going to remember many of those series of letters. Now look at this list. How many could you come up with? My guess is you could probably come up with more from the second than the first. However, the original list, X, ESPN, HBO, NBC, CBS, X, is identical to this list, as you can see. I would say most of you could reproduce this list with few errors, if any, and you could probably do it having looked at the list for half the time as compared to the other. What you've done is you've chunked. And what that did is that created space in your working memory so that I could probably have added NBA, NFL, other acronyms, maybe job-specific acronyms that you're familiar with, to that list. And you could have remembered those too, only having the same exposure time. You probably could have remembered. Once you chunk, you've cleared space in your working memory. And how this ties to building background is this. When you're familiar with something, you can chunk it more easily. It doesn't have to be an acronym. It can be anything that you're familiar with to the point where you don't even have to think about it. You know what ESPN is. You know what CBS is. You know what those things are. You're so familiar with it that you can just condense it, slide it over in your brain, and start packing more in there. And start working with more because you understand what those things are. That initial list was so novel that you had to think about it and you had to try to remember each individual part because all of it was new. You know the letters, we learned those when we were in first grade, right? Those are just letters from the alphabet. But you didn't know them in that order. It was completely novel and new. As soon as it was familiar, condensed, and you chunked it, and now you have more space in your working memory to continue working with whatever it is that you're working with. Finally, the fourth benefit of building background knowledge is it provides clarity to the ambiguous. What I want you to do to illustrate this is pause your video, go to the section right, it should be right under the video here, and pull up the Word document. What I want you to do is read that, and I can almost guarantee that you're going to know every single word in this paragraph. I want you to read it, and when you're finished reading it, I want you to create a title. Just write a title, not be one word or a couple words, just title what you think this passage should be called. When you're finished with that, come back and play the video. Okay, now you've titled your video, or you've titled your passage. I want to know if anybody figured out what this was. Maybe you've seen it before, or maybe you didn't figure it out. But I would say most of you, although you knew all the words in this passage, did not really understand what in the world you should call this. I mean, maybe it was sequencing or ordering. It seemed really ambiguous. It could have been anything. It wasn't very specific. If you build background knowledge as an instructor, you provide clarity to the ambiguous. How many people said, oh, this is clearly about doing laundry? If you're a person who does a lot of laundry, then you may have gotten this one. But if not, this may have been so ambiguous that you didn't really know what it was talking about. If I would have said to you in my initial instructions, if I would have said to you, hey, read this paragraph, you're going to know all the words. And this paragraph is about doing laundry. And I told you it's about doing laundry. Then I could have given you another instruction. I could have said, as you read, mark and then denote 1 through 5, step 1 through 5 of how to do it, whatever the article says. I could have made any number of instructions to you, and you could have been able to do that easily because you knew the words, you comprehended what it said, and I told you, hey, this is what it's about. I cleared up that ambiguous language that the author, the manner in which the author wrote that passage. I cleared that up. If that's cleared up, now you're free to comprehend and do other things with it. All too often, we make blind reading assignments to our students and say, read this, and then expect them to answer questions when maybe, in fact, that reading that we assigned was so ambiguous, they'll come back to class and say, I read it and I understood it, but I still couldn't answer your questions because they were focusing on the wrong parts because they didn't even know what it was about. That's the fourth and final benefit to building background knowledge. Now, while these 4 benefits of building background knowledge are research-based and largely common knowledge in the field of literacy, I still should give credit to this book, Why Don't Students Like School by Daniel T. Willingham. He's actually a cognitive scientist, and that's why some of this was a little more focused on the brain than necessarily just behaviors. And I would suggest or recommend that you read this book. It has an incredible amount of information and a lot of applicability to the classroom. So